Welcome to the Books and Music Review show. And usually we are on Saturdays from about 12:30, but you'll see us at other times, so keep switching to channel 34, CTV. And today we're going to introduce a really good book. Gerard, you have a great book review coming up, and the name of the book is Destiny and Power, and it's by, go Gerard.
The author is John Meacham. You can see the book right here, the front cover. And the subtitle is The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, which is a very deliberate title because George H.W. Bush's family sort of mirrors the evolution, for good or ill, of the United States from actually preceding our founding. There were his family parts of it came over here on the Mayflower, and other parts settled in the United States in the 17th century. I know it's unusual. I only have one WASP friend with a similar family lineage, people that came here at or around the time of the Mayflower and the first English, the first Puritan and settlements and major settlements of the eastern seaboard. And George Bush Sr., George Herbert Walker Bush's family kind of mirrors that progression. He had family that came out on the Mayflower. He had a distant ancestor, Obadiah, who enlisted in the Continental Army, I believe at the age of 15 or 16 years old. He fought in the American Revolution. And there was even a Prescott, a distant ancestor from named Prescott, who was riding with Paul Revere, and the progression of the family, it just kind of mirrored the United States. He had a relative, excuse me, who went to California to find his fortune in the gold rush. There's an interesting parallel between this and what his great grandson would do in the future, when he decided to forego opportunities that he might have had remaining on the East Coast at an investment firm, at an investment bank, and decided to strike out on his own and go to Texas, to Midland, to sort of ride the wave of crude oil, the future in a lot of ways, parallel to the gold rush and the gold boom out in the West. And that's another interesting parallel, the kind of migration of the Bush family from the eastern seaboard, from New York, from Maine, from Connecticut. His father, of course, Prescott Bush, was a senator from Connecticut, and the migration westward to California, to Texas, to the boom states in the Sun Belt. And this actually reflected also a change in the power base of the Republican Party. A lot of people don't know this, but his great-grandfather was actually active in the Democratic Party, and so George Herbert Walker Bush was a lifelong Republican, and his father as well was a Republican, but they were actually members of the Democratic Party for a long time. So you kind of see the transformation in this one little family of the Republican Party but in a broader sense of the country at large, just through individual decisions that particular members of the Bush family made for themselves that they thought would increase their chances of fruitfulness. And one of the themes that this book emphasizes, destiny and power. The destiny and power. That theme, it's reflected in the decisions of the Bushes, who had this sort of WASP sensibility, this ideal of noblesse oblige, of serving public service, not only in terms of the military, dating back to the Revolution, and even George's father serving in World War I, which was a very transformative experience for him, as it was for the other million American men that served in that war. But it's not only in the military, but in terms of the private sector and then the public sector, increasingly, the idea that you have to serve, that you have to render some good to the public for what for the gifts that have been granted to you. Now, in some cases, in the Bush family, this was actually reflected in terms of religion. His George Herbert Walker's great grandfather was an Episcopal minister who actually served as a minister in New Jersey and on Staten Island itself in West Brighton. Now, eventually he left the church and became a Unitarian, but the idea that this was a family that needed to that was embedded in with the idea of public service is something that persisted throughout the generations, and this biography is largely a way of scrutinizing and examining that goal, and how this goal of trying to perform public service could be reconciled with this inner drive, this inner desire to retain power. And that's something else that really comes through in this book. When you look at George Bush's life, the idea that he wanted and he greatly desired to have power, and one of the reasons being that he thought he would be a better public servant than his competitors. And you see this all the way from the time he decided to run for the Senate in Texas and was accused of being a Yankee carpetbagger, and his two unsuccessful runs for the Senate, all the way through his presidential run against Ronald Reagan, and his successful run for president in 1988, and in 1992. And on the one hand, there was this dichotomy between desperately wanting to beat your opponents and to win, and something that was carried over from his days as a baseball player and competing in athletics, and was instilled in him to a large degree by his mother, Dorothy Bush, who was an avid sportswoman and used to challenge her children to compete with each other. There was that sense that this was a contest and you need to finish ahead of your competitors, but also there's a dichotomy between that and the idea that you wanted to win because you thought you would be the best public servant. And at times these things worked at cross purposes, because for a large amount of time, George Bush was basically the sidekick, or the servant, in the sense of working as an ambassador to China, or working for the CIA, or working as the head of the RNC as the Republican Party was imploding during the Watergate crisis, or even working as vice president and as the attack dog during the vice presidential debate in 1984. And a lot of his career, most of it, was working in this capacity as someone who was the ally of more important, or ostensibly more important, figures like Gerald Ford or Ronald Reagan. Yet at the same time, there was always a desire on the part of George Bush to wield the reins of power, and that's one of the more interesting parts of this book, the description of his essentially laying the groundwork for his successful 1988 presidential campaign against Michael Dukakis, and how he was trying to use these decades and decades of public service and being the ally of more important figures as a means of communicating to the American public and to the voters that excuse me, that he was fully prepared to wield power as the most important person, basically the most important political leader on the planet, the head of the free world, so to speak. And that was one of the more interesting sections in this book, and it led into a very intriguing chapter about his desire to fashion this new world order, which in his view was a sort of multipolar world where, instead of having two main enemies, two main rivals, the Soviet Union and the USSR, dominating the world, you could have this multinational alliance of great powers to shape a more peaceful world. And this is one of the things that George Bush gets criticized a lot for, especially among conservatives and conservative Republicans. And that's, as an aside, that's another recurring theme throughout the book, the idea of George Bush being an outsider, even though he distanced himself to a large degree from the politics of his father, Prescott Bush, a rather liberal senator from Connecticut, and moved to Texas and adopted more conservative stances. He still wasn't thought of as a movement conservative, someone in the Goldwater vein, even though he supported Barry Goldwater and was ran for most of his career as a conservative Republican. Conservatives never really adopted him into their family and never quite trusted him. And some of these reservations were validated later on in his presidency when he went back on his no new taxes pledge and other items that he pursued that were inimical to conservatives in the Republican Party. So there's they looked at his post-Cold War mission with very heavy skepticism, because they looked at it as a way of diminishing national sovereignty and essentially some of them looked at it as a way of putting constraints on U.S. power abroad, but others looked at it as a way of instituting a globalized, very homogeneous political system that negated the important parts of the American experiment. And that chapter is really interesting because it kind of sketches out his ideas, what he thought as he was dealing with these crises that seemed to resolve themselves over the course of his presidency, beginning with the fall of the Berlin Wall and leading up to the coup in Russia by hardline communists and the eventual implosion of that coup and the dissolution of the USSR into individual, independent and sovereign states. And they, and this is basically a look at how he dealt with these crises, along with the Tiananmen Square massacre and other global issues that all occurred within the span of his presidency, and that he had to address on the fly, think of ways to handle these crises without exacerbating them and without provoking a world war, or if not a world war, at least military hostilities between the U.S. and one of the last global hegemons, the communist Soviet Union. And in a sense, that's what he was dealing with at the time. And I think the book does sketch out his views, which look, in retrospect, or at least I think in retrospect, you can see that they weren't driven by malice, even though the idea of globalization, or at least globalism, of great powers working cooperatively to kind of manipulate pieces on the chessboard instead of warring with each other. I think in retrospect that is a little naive, but you could also understand some of the things that he was thinking as he was dealing with the dissolution of the USSR and trying to fashion a diplomatic stance that was tough enough to protect the interests, the aspirations of these former Soviet republics, or Soviet republics, people in Soviet republics desperate to throw off the yoke of the Soviet Union, to protect their interests and their pursuit of freedom without provoking a global clash with the Soviet Union. Excuse me. And I think the power politics aspect of that is very interesting, but even more interesting for me, the more interesting part about this book was the examination of the Bush family life and how the Bush family, their evolution sort of mirrored the evolution of the United States. There's a picture in this book of George Bush. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a picture of him meeting Babe Ruth. This was towards the end of Babe Ruth's life when he was dying, and this was, I believe, after George Bush went back to college after serving as a fighter pilot, and there's the famous mission to bomb a radio tower in Chichijima, a Japanese radio tower, where he bailed out of the plane, and unfortunately he was the only survivor, but he managed to stay afloat long enough to be rescued. And this is kind of one of the defining moments of George Bush's career and his life. And even as the author was speaking with him, some 6 decades or 6.5 decades later, he still welled up with tears when he was talking about losing the men that he had served with, and asking himself why he had been rescued, why rather than them, and it served as a sort of impetus for him to go on and provide some sort of redemption for this. But that part of the book is a lot more interesting, if you ask me. Not just that story, which is worth reading in its own right, but the entire story of the Bush family. The fact that his great, I believe his great grandfather, I'm sorry, great great grandfather, the one who served as an Episcopal minister, nearly died at birth, and his doctors told his parents that he wouldn't be able to survive that long, so not to get too attached to him. And the kind of remarkable life that his his descendants had, it's really fascinating. Just the entire family spanned the gamut from railroad interests and working for John D. Rockefeller's brother to the Wall Street boom, to oil speculating, to service in the American Revolution and World War I, World War II. And it just really it provides you with a panoramic scope of this one family whose lives sort of mirrored the life of the United States as it progressed from being a British colony to independence to a global superpower that one of their own was the head of for 4 years. And there are also a lot of really interesting vignettes. One of the really moving ones was about George H.W. Bush's daughter Robin, who died before her fifth birthday because of cancer. And that's another really interesting way that their lives sort of mirrored mirrored the story of this country, because she was given only a very short time to live, because back then children who developed leukemia it was essentially a death sentence if a child was diagnosed with leukemia back in the 50s. And today, I think something like 3/4 or 80% of childhood leukemia cases are resolved satisfactorily, in the sense that the children survive past 5 years, and most of them into adulthood, because of the progress we've made against cancer. So, I mean, there's stories like that, and just so many other stories in this approximately 700-page long biography of George Herbert Walker Bush. So it's not only a biography of George Bush and a biography of his parents and his grandparents and, of course, his sons. And that's another path the book goes on after his retirement, his involvement in his sons' political careers, the careers of Jeb and George W. Bush, the 43rd president of the United States, and his differences with the 41st president and how they were reconciled, and the public nature of this family dynamic and political dynamic.
4 minutes.
So it's not just a story of him, it's a story of his entire family, his ancestors and his descendants, and everyone around them, and a story about the past and the present and perhaps the future of the United States. And that's one of the interesting parts about this book. It just covers so much territory. It's not simply just a political biography of an important political figure who had held power at the nexus of some of the most important historical events to ever occur globally: the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the liberation of their satellites non-violently, almost without exception, and the Gulf War, and the prolonged and protracted problem that we've had in the Middle East. It's not just about these huge defining issues. It's also about the individual life choices and the family dynamics that occurred in the Bush family and the Walker family, and in the family of Barbara Bush. The Pierce, she came from the Pierces, and it describes their integration into this kind of patchwork of old, quote unquote, old money wasps. So, and that's another really fascinating aspect of this biography: his relationship with his wife and how she was sort of a political surrogate and a sustainer for their entire family, much like George Bush's mother was, Dorothy. She sustained the entire family as he and his sons pursued politics and pursued the political world. So Barbara Bush, in her own right, is a very fascinating figure, and there could be a very intriguing biography of her life alone. So it's not just a biography about George Bush. It really is the American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. In other words, the Odyssey of the country as a whole, and how this one family fit into it. So I would definitely recommend, if you have the opportunity, get hold of this book, Destiny and Power by John Meacham. It's undoubtedly worth reading, especially if you're interested in American history, political science, and even if you're not, I think the trials and tribulations and the way they were addressed by the Bushes, that the human interest side of this book is worth the price of worth the price. So hopefully you get a chance to read this book in the future, and we'll talk about other things in the weeks to come. All right. See you next time.